pleasure to be hosting our next instalment of Conversations on Practice, which is an ongoing series at McNally Jackson that focuses on artists' craft development and how they go about their daily work. This month's instalment will feature David Shields, who is here to talk about his latest work, I Think You're Totally Wrong, A Quarrel. The series is hosted by the wonderful Glenn Kurtz, who also curates it. David Shields is the author of 15 books, including Reality Hunger, named one of the best books of 2010 by more than 30 publications. The Thing About Life is That One Day We'll Be Dead, a New York Times bestseller, and Black Planet, finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and 2 NEA Fellowships, Shields has published essays and stories in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Esquire, Yale Review, Village Voice, among many others, and his work has been translated into 20 languages. Glenn Kurtz is the author of Practicing and Musicians Return to Music and 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film, which was selected as the best book of 2014 by The New Yorker, The Boston Globe, and National Public Radio. His writing has been published in The New York Times, Salon, Southwest Review, Zozover, and elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you, McNally Jackson, for hosting us. We've been doing this series now for more than 4 years, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us, David. It's a great pleasure to have you again.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
We spoke, when was it? About 2 years ago, I guess, when How Literature Saved My Life came out. So we're going to start by doing a little reading from this book as a sort of stage setting, because the entire book is a conversation. Actually, maybe you'll speak just for a few moments about the context of the book and sort of how it got set up, and then we'll do our reading.
Sure, that sounds good. The book is called I Think You're Totally Wrong, A Quarrel, and the quarrel is between myself and my former student, Caleb Powell, who's now 46, and he was my student 25 years ago. But the essential debate between him and me is that Caleb always wanted to become an artist, but he overcommitted to life. He's a stay-at-home dad to 3 young girls, whereas I always wanted to become a human being, but I overcommitted to art. That's the essential joke of it. I'm a human being, I hope, and Caleb is capable of artistic gestures, but the basic donné is that I'm trying to pull Caleb toward the artistic realm. He's trying to pull me toward a more visceral realm. And that's the basic premise of the book.
So you went away for 4 days, was it only? And the book is excerpts of the conversations that you had over the course of those 4 days.
Right. I guess I would just say that the excerpts, the book looks more verbatim than it really is. We went away for 4 days, as Glenn said, to a cabin 35 miles north of Seattle, and we talked for 16 hours every day and taped every possible beep and blurb, but the original manuscript was perhaps 400,000 words, and we spent a couple of years essentially sort of curating and culling the manuscript down to, I think, a relatively focused book, very much on the vexed relationship between life and art, so that the book looks like a kind of found document, but is actually extremely rewritten and refocused text, I think.
Okay, so why don't we read a passage in which I'll play Caleb. Did you and Lori ever discuss having a second child?
Yes, in what was perhaps not my greatest moment, I said no.
No?
No. I was teaching 12 months a year, 4 quarters at the University of Washington, plus any teaching gigs that came up to make ends meet and have virtually no time to write. Now all I do is think about my 22-year-old daughter Natalie, but those first couple of years, I must admit I wasn't hugely loving being a parent, and probably most importantly, Lori and I weren't getting along all that well.
What's the age difference between you and Lori?
Same age. She had the famously bad formulation of, we're not getting along that great, so let's have a second child. My response was, I'm pretty ambivalent about almost everything, but one thing I'm certain about is that I don't want a second child. I'm sorry. I wasn't draconian about it. I just said, that's the way I feel. How do you feel? And she said, more or less, I'm not 100% certain myself, and if you're pretty certain, I'll yield to that. That's my memory. I should probably ask her if I'm even remembering correctly. I do remember talking about it with her later, and she said, if I had really wanted to have had another child, I would have just had one. Which at the time, I remember thinking was the most amazing thing I'd ever heard. Men are apparently that manipulable. I know the conventional wisdom is that if one person, especially the woman, wants a second child, you're supposed to say, aye, aye, Captain. But I didn't do that. It was a very selfish decision, having mostly to do with writing and a little having to do with not wanting to be paying college tuition when I was 67. My feeling at the time was, let's raise Natalie and we'll see where we are then. And if we wind up getting divorced, each of us will still be 54. Not dead yet. Pretty pathetic.
Did you say that to her?
No, of course not. But I remember Lori saying at one point that if we didn't have Natalie to connect us, she didn't know why we would stay married. For a variety of reasons that I can go into if you want, I now feel very happily married. And I couldn't imagine not being with Lori. But like any marriage, our marriage has had its ups and downs. And that was undoubtedly its nadir. And it wasn't horrible, it was just one discussion. It's one of Lori's best traits. She moves on. At least to me, she presents as the queen of non-regret. But if we had never had a child, the marriage would almost certainly have ended.
That's something you decide before you get married. Didn't you talk about how many kids you wanted?
No,
How many years were you together before you got married?
4 years.
And it never came up.
Both of us were equally ambitious.
analysis or deconstruction rather than pursuing it. And I think that there's an example of that in the passage that we read, where right at the end, where you make an interesting turn in this conversation. You're two guys, you're sharing these kind of painful stories about your relationships with your wives, and he's talked about his wife's miscarriage, and you say, to me, the most interesting aspect of the whole thing is that lore of black culture for white people. You say white people, you don't say to you, Caleb. So in a sense, you're already deflecting that comment. Maybe it's specifically about him, but obviously it's about him. But he also doesn't respond to that because it's not of interest to him, or he says, I've thought about it, and that's the end of it.
Right.
It's complicated, and that's the end of it. But actually, that's a moment where two things could have happened, where on the one hand, you could actually get into him as a self in his, because he did make this decision to go have a beer. And that's definitely an interesting thing. It's the kind of thing a short story could be written about.
Sure.
But he chooses not to. And at the same time, you make this kind of turn from the personal into a larger theoretical issue, which then also kind of gets shut down a little bit. So for me, reading the book, I was a little bit frustrated occasionally by you have these two approaches, but instead of them causing an explosion, they kind of cause each other to fizz a little bit.
That's interesting. I think that's a fair criticism, but to me it's barking up the wrong sort of tree bark, in the sense that, to me, the book is about the comedy of that particular miss. And to me, the book is about sort of confession without tears. What can the essay form look like? What can nonfiction look like now? How can we have a memoir form that isn't woe is me memoir? How can we find a form that matches the compression and concision and velocity of contemporary culture? So there are, to me, I hope, nice moments in the book that aren't your sort of standard sort of Plato-Socrates exchanges. There are more moments such as Caleb's trying to talk to me about global terror, and I'm not paying attention, and I say, look at that beautiful waterfall. Those are the moments the book majors in, not sort of the extended discourse of civilized conversation. It's these tiny moments where I accuse Caleb of being an alcoholic, and he just can't wrestle with it, and we end up sort of settling for sort of guy talk. And I'm trying to find a sort of usable language to talk about contemporary experience. And so, to me, maybe this is a little too fancy or a little theoretical or sort of after-the-fact rationalization, but to me the book, we've already had those other forms for centuries, like that we've had that extended language. And to me, I'm trying to sort of model in the book, how difficult it is now to find a way to talk about experience. So, to me, ultimately, the book does get at relatively visceral experience. And the core of the book is this line of Yeats, who said, out of our arguments with other people, we create politics. Out of our arguments with ourselves, we create poetry. And Caleb is always sort of clinging to a kind of argument with other people, that he's against, a really radical position that he takes is that he's against sex trafficking. It's a really difficult position to take. And then I'm really interested in trying to harvest my ambivalence, my doubts. So that's the core that the book tries to get to.
So, in lieu of doing a more, well, in lieu of using analytical language in short, writing an essay about that line,
Right.
what was it about dialogue in particular, and not here necessarily with Caleb as such, but dialogue in particular, that allowed you, or that made you feel that it got at something essential that the traditional language of analysis and essay didn't get to?
Not sure that it does. I'm interested in having many tools. You know, I'm very interested in collaboration. I collaborated with James Franco and Caleb on the film adaptation of the book, and the film is premiering next month. I collaborated with another former student, Jeff Ragsdale, of this book called Jeff, One Lonely Guy. It came out in 2012. I did another book with my cousin once removed called That Thing You Do With Your Mouth, a sexual autobiography of Samantha Matthews, which is coming out in June. I'm very interested in collaboration in that particular dialogue. Meanwhile, I have 3,000 pages of notes on my next book. So, you know, I'm interested in endlessly analyzing my own humble psyche, but I'm also interested in getting outside of myself through collaboration. So I'm not sure there's anything that dialogue can get to that I can't get to, but I'm, you know, that in a way a fiction writer invents characters, supposedly, and that, you know, at 58, you know, I've written 16 books, and, you know, there's a sense in which I can sort of predict in certain ways the moves that I'm going to make. And one of the gestures I'm drawn toward now is a sort of vampiric using of colleagues and friends, acquaintances, and family members as kind of interesting sort of sounding boards, nemeses, voice boxes, you know, in a way it's a sort of reportorial gesture. So, you know, I wanted Caleb to question me and me to question him. You know, the essayist essentially harvests contradiction, harvests doubt, and there's no more direct contradiction than someone yelling at you, you know, you're a fool, you know, or whatever. You're solipsistic. You're repeating yourself. All of your collage books are nothing more than Esquire dubious achievement issues, or whatever it is that Caleb yells at me in his well-intentioned ignorance. And so, you know, I wanted to see how I could defend myself against a kind of scorched earth critique.
So one of the things that I was, again, kind of both frustrated and provoked by in the book was that you do have these arguments about specific texts, but then you don't look at the texts. Like, in other words, there's one about Nicholson Baker's book about pacifism.
Human Smoke.
Human Smoke, exactly. And you have this radically different reading of, I mean, the most fundamental thing, what the book is saying, whether
Right.
it's for World War II or against it.
Right.
And, you know, that's the kind of thing where, I mean, maybe it's too seminary, but you would want someone making a claim about it to make their case, which, to me, you would have to do using the text. You would point to the passage and say, see, this is what it says, and that's supported by the apparatus of the book. And you make that gesture, but again, Caleb isn't kind of interested in doing it. Did you talk at all about being more, I don't know if rigorous is the right word, but in a sense more text-bound in your arguments about things?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think if anything, the book seems plenty text-based to me. I mean, perhaps it's a different insensibility in the sense that I'm interested, I mean, in a way you're calling for a more traditional book, that in a way is a more written book. And we wanted to always strive to have the illusion, at least, of an actual spoken conversation. So I think the book gets relatively rigorously at our fundamental difference, that my go-to position is always the solves of art, and Caleb's go-to position is always the solves of sensation and of experience. So in a way, each little argument matters less than our essential positions. But again, perhaps interestingly, Glenn, I think we're talking almost past each other, a la Caleb and David, in the sense that you're calling for an interestingly and possibly excellent traditional book, but I'm interested in, to me, the core of the book is that how Caleb and I slide right past each other. That's the book. What David Carr would call the only truth is the space between people. So that, for instance, I haven't read your new book yet, but it sounds extremely good, and I'm eager to read it. But as we were talking about it before the event, the gesture I'd make with that book, which is only my gesture, not yours, is that I'd want more recursion. That is to say, I'd want a more radical subjectivity, a questioning of the access to knowledge, a questioning of one's own motivation. Whereas I think for you, this interesting book that you have written about people in Poland in 1939, that you took, I gather, a relatively traditional repertorial gesture, whereas I'd want, to me, kind of a more postmodern questioning of what you were doing, the limits of knowledge, the microphone not working. That kind of recursion is really crucial to me. It's what in physics is called the observer effect. The perceiver, by his presence, always alters what's perceived. And one can certainly lean on this too heavily, but to me it's really important to foreground that. And so in a way, maybe it's an interestingly fundamental difference between us.
We should come back in a year and you can interview me about that.
There you go.
Because in fact I do this fundamentally. I mean, this book is about a home movie from 1938 that I discovered in 2009 of a small town in Poland, and it's about the search to identify the people in the thing. And whereas I started out wondering what was life like that this film is documenting? What can I say about that life? And very quickly realized that the book instead was about how is that town remembered now? It's remembered in a sense because of this film. It's remembered in a couple of people's memories. It's remembered in a sense in documents that are scattered around the world and in a couple of photographs that have been preserved.
So
You
do put that kind of
epistemological
pressure
on
it.
The book is about altogether.
Well, so to me that's interesting then that you did that same approach in our book. You felt frustrated about.
Well, I guess
perhaps you felt that we overemphasized that.
Well, I guess I was looking for. I guess like the passage that I read before, I was looking for more sort of consistent follow-up, I guess, of the arguments that did get elucidated. It seemed to me that you would bring up issues as is characteristic of conversation, where things rise and then fall back down, rise again 3 days later in some slightly different context or form. And I was, I guess, missing a more consistent, not consistent in the sense of intellectually rigorous, but consistent in the sense of, as you say, recursive approach to certain issues, so that there was, maybe that's the traditional part of me. I'm looking for development of the ideas over the course of the essay.
Well, I'm not sure if Glenn is really moving product here at all. But, to me, there is really a very strong psychic psychic undertow that, you know, you have to hear underneath it all that there's this huge psychic move where Caleb and I very subtly buy books and change positions. That the arguments, the overt sort of civilized arguments, go into a series of rat holes and don't exactly emerge clear, but you're supposed to hear underneath the text a clear evolution of each of our sort of soul states, and at the end that we do a very subtle sort of trading places, and that's the book, not the 9-page discourse about human smoke.
Well, so to move product, I want to say that I really loved the book, and I found it provocative. And I mean, I said this to you before when we were talking, just that it made me want to jump in and participate in the conversation.
I think that's the gaps that we wanted. I mean, there is no higher praise. I remember, Susan, that you said when you read the book, you were scribbling, you know, yes, no, how could you, or whatever. And it's that kind of book that I wanted, rather than Plato and Socrates sculpting, you know, insanely perfect 20-page arguments. It's more like, oh my God, I can't believe that you didn't use that moment to explain this. Those are the very spaces we wanted the reader to enter.
Right. And that was in fact what I did. I
Great.
fell into those gaps.
See, the book works perfectly.
And it makes it feel like, you know, you want to be in conversation, and here I am, I get that chance.
There you
so
go.
I felt really lucky. Like, oh, I got to ask you about all these things. So when you talked about the sculpting, you had said before that you actually did an enormous amount of editing and shaping of material. So I'm curious about that then. You explicitly said you wanted the illusion of this kind of spontaneous conversation when it wasn't necessarily spontaneous. So talk a little bit about how you undertook the editing process.
Well, you know, there is that famous story when Hemingway was, or actually Faulkner was hired to adapt a Hemingway novel for film, and everybody thought that Faulkner could simply take the dialogue from, I forget what Hemingway novel, because it sounded so lifelike, that you could just sort of cut and paste, and you'd have your screenplay done in, you know, in 6 hours. But they found when they actually took the Hemingway dialogue and tried to get the actors to speak it, the dialogue was impossibly stylized. That what sounds very lifelike on the page sounds impossibly stilted on screen or when spoken. And that's sort of a metaphor for how Caleb and I try to work. The book sounds to maybe the casual reader as if that we just sort of went off to a cabin and clipped sort of 60 3-page passages and called it our book. But in fact, you know, much of the book was heavily rewritten after the fact, always trying to make it sound like, you know, we'd interrupt, we'd have, in reality, I went on and on about Nichols and Baker, but that struck us as, you know, as scholastic and relatively tedious. And so, I mean, no offense, but, and then basically we were constantly, it was a fast, you know, the book is about the relationship between life and art, and one of the beautiful ironies and paradoxes about the book is that it became more lifelike by us hugely rewriting it, if you follow. And then a second epilogue that was really kind of gorgeous was that, as I mentioned, my former student James Franco has made a film of it, and we had written a script for the film, but on the first day of filming, a real-life, real-time argument broke out between James and Caleb and me, and we ended up just filming the argument and following the argument, and that became more real. So the ironies and paradoxes and contradictions kept on building, by which, I think we created a better work of art by following life, and then we kind of made it more lifelike by endlessly sculpting it and calling it verbatim. I mean, there's some complicated way in which the book, I hope, embodies relatively nicely the very themes that it's talking about.
So does that mean then that you win the argument in the editing room? Because the goal, after all, is to produce, in essence, a work of art. And even if Caleb is there saying, well, really what's more important is to be life-like, to experience and engage life, because in the end, you're writing a book.
Right.
And you're the writer, that you get to, as I say, you get to win the argument in the editing room.
Well, I think that we both revised the book, that we passed the book back and forth constantly to make the book better, I hope. But even there, it was interesting that Caleb always wanted to sort of fatten and widen the book and make it more, in a way, lifelike, sort of shapeless and rich and thick. And I was always sort of sculpting it downward. But, you know, I think the moment that we did the book, we were outside of lived experience. We were making a book from the very beginning. And then on the film thing was interesting that we just spent 4 days in LA and filmed it, and then we gave over, 20 hours to a very good film editor who found the good 90 minutes and pulled, I think, a really nice film out of what was, or of 20 hours of just sort of babbling. So it's always the edit that always makes it.
So the argument between life and art is always won by the editor.
Totally, there she is. There she is, the editor herself. So,
yeah, I was going to say,
what questions?
Seems like a good place to turn it over to the audience.
If we have, I
sure.
would love to open things up. People have questions, comments. You've got to basically choose between sort of Glenn and me today.
One question that comes up is, why isn't Caleb here?
Well, Caleb was on the West Coast tour and failed he was we've got to blame Kathy and Anna. They did not have the budget, I mean, no, but Caleb and I did the LA, San Francisco, Portland, LA, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, and I had my own business at the East Coast, visiting my daughter and doing a reading in Boston and visiting publishers in New York. And so we thought we'd do, I did a reading in Brooklyn with my friend Amy Fusselman, and she played Caleb, and my friend Lucas Mann played Caleb in Providence, and then the journalist Christopher Lydon played Caleb in Boston. I think if I could maybe completely shut Caleb to the side, I'd be really, really happy. But, basically Caleb did the West Coast, and for very legitimate budgetary reasons, we could only afford to send me. So I tried to endlessly rub that in to Caleb. So.
Mention the movie.
What's that?
Mention the movie, because eventually they'll be able to see Caleb and you.
Oh,
together.
that's true.
Yeah.
The movie will be premiering. I assume you're all cordially invited, and I assume you'll all go to the opening on May 4th in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. It's at the Vancouver's Doxa Documentary Film Festival, and we're going to have the premiere there, and it's probably going to open at the Seattle Film Festival, and we'll hope and assume it'll get a wider distribution than just the Pacific Northwest. But
well,
we're working on it.
If you plays in New York, you have to invite all
Yeah,
of your understudy Calebs to go.
There you go. There you go. What other thoughts and questions do people have? Anybody? Kathy?
Yes. When you were taking the first 4 days and sort of rewriting it and editing it down, did you give yourself rules about, we have to keep at least some of the original dialogue? Or did
Oh, definitely.
yeah.
Definitely. Like that became one of the comedies, I hope, of the book is that we actually talk. I don't know if you had a further, if you wanted, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no.
But, that basically, that I got in interesting, intentional trouble with my book Reality Hunger 5 years ago, where I remixed various people's quotations for extremely obvious reasons that went completely ignored by many people. But we wanted to make sure that this book didn't become sort of Reality Hunger 3.0, that wasn't the core of the book. So we didn't rewrite it that much, but essentially in person that we were full of ums and likes and you knows and does like anyone else, but on the page I think that we are relatively intelligent and witty fellows, and so we just sort of pumped up the dialogue almost like Faulkner rewriting Hemingway, just sort of make it pop and just sort of give it endings. At one point I think there's this one line of Caleb's that I ended up stealing and using as my own. It was my favorite line of Caleb's, and I just said, I'm taking it, and it's my favorite line in the book almost, but you'll never know which one. But it was, basically 90% of it comes from the book, but to me it's all in the compression of it. Like if there's a bunch of good lines and they're surrounded by a bunch of dross, those good lines vanish, as we all know, as writers and readers and editors. So a lot of the edit was taking the sort of 400,000 words and what's that famous line from the sculptor, you carve away everything that isn't rhinoceros. We just tried to find the rhinoceros. So, there was relatively little change in terms of us completely making up that Caleb bungee jumped in South Africa. If Caleb says that he bungee jumped in South Africa, Caleb probably said that. So, yeah.
Did you continue the argument as you were rewriting the book? Did you pick up your arguments and keep going?
I mean, we've been flaming each other on email the entire day today. I mean, we can't stop arguing. It's sort of weird, and I can't even explain it. But we definitely argued, and throughout the editing process, I mean, not vehemently or violently, Caleb always wanted to include the political diatribes, his discussion of Chomsky or his discussion of sex trafficking, and if anything, I want them even less. They're not necessarily my favorite parts of the book, but that's what makes the book good, is that it's not just me talking about how much I love Blaise Pascal. I've done that plenty, and there's something bracing and new about Caleb going on and on about prisoners or whatever. But we definitely argued quite a bit before you saw it, and I'm trying to think of what the key arguments were. Mainly volume versus concision, and excellence on my part versus just horror show on Caleb's part. What else? Anybody else have a question or two?
Yeah, listening to you talk, I keep wondering what is different. I hear that the recursiveness is different and the fact that it's collaborative rather than one mind producing characters, but it seems like you're crafting yourselves as characters in much the way one crafts fictional characters. So I was wondering if you could comment on the difference between creating a fictional character or creating the non-fictional character.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I began as a fiction writer. I wrote 3 novels that were published and that are pretty good between 1984 and 1992, from like age 28 to age 36 or so. And then, I just, for some reason, different forms release different people's best intelligences. And for some reason, a non-fictional frame releases my best and quirkiest intelligence. I think in certain ways we are semi-writing fiction, that we're taking an experience and remaking it. But if you were to ask me, just sort of sit at your desk and make up a conversation with Caleb and you, to me it would not be as good as what we came up with. I'm very interested in life except for 1 inch, and it's that 1 inch that makes it, I hope, a work of art. And there would be people who have the imagination to write that book, but I think I'm uniquely blessed without imagination, so I just sort of, or at least fanciful imagination. My imagination is deeply rooted in remaking experience at a very close to the ground level. And so I agree with you that we're almost making fiction, but it's crucial to me that we have the cutting field of the 400,000 words of stuff to pull from. Once I've got that, I can really go to town, I think. Whereas for some of you fiction writers like Susan or Paul, you might find that non-fictional frame actually constraining. I get very relaxed once I have a quasi-documentary frame. Then I can start making stuff up.
Yeah.
Perhaps a couple last questions. Susan?
So, as a non-writer, maybe this isn't fair to ask, but how will your relationship with Caleb change once you're past this project?
No, it's a good question, and I feel I don't want to make it too sentimental, but I think we're getting along really well. We're doing really well, and it's us against the world. And I feel like our relationship has sort of thawed in a good way. I really appreciate him. The funny thing is, to me, Caleb's wife is crazy about me because I say everything that drives her completely crazy. And my wife, Lauren, who likes this book better than any book I've ever done, loves Caleb because he says all the things about me that drive her crazy. So I'm essentially thankful for Caleb for saving my marriage. Sam, did you have a thought?
Yeah, like you mentioned, say, Blaise Pascal, who just seems to present us with just opposites, and that can't really get anywhere. But there's, I guess, a goal of reaching some sort of, or transcending those opposites, that contradiction. I'm wondering did you and Caleb actually begin to agree on anything after this argument, or like beyond this argument?
I mean, how did we actually trade places, or?
Yeah.
Well, I think, again, I don't want to wrap this all up with too neat a bow, or pretend that we hugged at the end or anything like that, but I think the essential thing for me is that Caleb is writing a book now about his obsession with Muslims and with Islam, and I've tried to urge him to have a sort of, for lack of a better word, Glenn, a sort of more recursive aspect, questioning himself, why he's so completely obsessed with it, and not just pretend to be this sort of soapbox orator. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a book of mine that's coming out in September is a book about war photography. That I think that Caleb, again, I'd be wary of too glib a a solution to it. I am still this irreducibly subjective person, and Caleb is an irreducibly, trying to think of a relatively neutral word, but an irreducibly, sort of engagé person. But I think we stole, the famous line of Freud's that, a successful therapy ends with the patient 10% different. And I think we definitely had a relatively successful therapy. We're both perhaps 9.9% better.
That seems like a good place to stop. It's a redemption narrative after all.
There you go. We were saying.
For a moment, we were all waiting.
There you go.
Well, David, thank you very much.
Thanks,
It's a pleasure talking with
Thanks
you.
a lot, everybody.
Thank you. And David will be happy to sign books as we. Thanks.
Yeah.